All right, so the Supreme Court has been on an absolute tear recently as they are sort of heading towards the end of their current session. We obviously talked about the affirmative action case that was brought before them, which they basically took a torch to affirmative action here in the US. They also recently decided on a case that was essentially deciding whether or not some certain companies would be allowed to just openly discriminate against LGBTQ people, and of course, they decided that, yeah, that's totally fine, which kind of gives you an insight in terms of where we are at here in the US at the moment. And then we had this one, which was a absolutely massive decision that they came down with that is going to have impacts, serious economic impacts for tens of millions of Americans. So, as pointed out here by NBC News, Supreme Court kills Biden's student loan relief plan. They say the justices ruled in two cases challenging President Joe Biden's authority to forgive federal student loans under a 2003 law called the HEROES Act. Now, there's obviously a lot to get into here with the Supreme Court, but also with the Biden administration and the strategy that they decided to go with in terms of trying to eliminate the $10,000 to $20,000 of student debt based on your income, based on whether or not you are a Pell Grant recipient. And of course, as they pointed out there, he decided to use this 2003 HEROES Act, which essentially is arguing that if you're in the middle of an emergency, a national emergency, which in this case would be the COVID pandemic, then the federal government has the ability to wipe away some portion of student debt. Now, the reason why that was never the strongest argument he could have gone with is that, number one, the Congress within the United States, the government, has already basically said that the COVID pandemic is no longer a national emergency, so that's number one. But number two, he had something that he could have used, which is the 1965 Higher Education Act, which explicitly delegates the authority to the Secretary of Education. Okay, in this case, it would be Cardona, who was Biden's Secretary of Education, and delegates that authority for him to just wipe the debt slate clean. So we were saying this from the beginning, that he should have gone with the 1965 Higher Education Act. He decided to go with the HEROES Act, and now we have this result here. Okay, so here from NBC News, just to get some of the basic details, and then obviously we're going to get to a lot more here. They say, the Supreme Court on Friday invalidated President Joe Biden's student loan debt relief plan, meaning the long-delayed proposal intended to implement a campaign trail promise will not go into effect. They say the justices, divided on 6-3 ideological lines, pretty predictable there, ruled in one of two of the cases that the program was an unlawful exercise of presidential power because it had not been explicitly approved by Congress. Biden said that the ruling was disappointing and vowed to take additional steps to relieve the financial burden on those holding the student loan debt. So I'll circle back around to what it seems like Biden's plan is going forward. It seems like he might actually lean into the 1965 Higher Education Act, at the end of this, but it's very unclear exactly how he's going to go about doing that. But they continue. They say the court rejected the Biden administration's arguments that the plan was lawful under the HEROES Act, this 2003 law, and they say the law says that the government can provide relief to recipients of student loans when there is, again, a national emergency, allowing it to act to ensure people are not in a worse position financially as a result of the emergency. Okay, so seems pretty reasonable, right? But they say the plan, which would have allowed eligible borrowers to cancel up to $20,000 in student debt and would have cost more than $400 billion, has been blocked since the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals issued a temporary hold all the way back in October. Okay, so already, I kind of take issue with the idea that this is going to cost $400 billion because, we're talking about like an entire generation of people, and actually multiple generations, because there are older Americans who still have student debt on their books. But $400 billion, it's not as if that money just sort of like evaporates into thin air. No, that would free up a lot of especially younger people who have this student debt to go inject that money straight back into the economy, which would grow the economy, which would be beneficial, right? Getting things like, a car loan or a down payment on a house or helping to pay for childcare or whatever the case may be. That money doesn't just disappear. So it's not just purely a cost. In fact, I would argue it would have an economic benefit, especially to those 40 million people. It's actually 43 million people, as they point out here. So they say the student loan proposal was important politically to Biden, as tackling student loan debt was a key pledge that he made on the campaign trail in 2020 to energize young voters. And I don't know if you guys have looked at some of the more recent polling data in terms of how Biden is doing with younger voters, but it has plummeted, okay? When he first announced that he was going to be doing the student debt forgiveness, that was sort of when it started to hit its peak, and he was up, I think, at about like 60% approval rating with young Americans. Now it's down like 30% or even lower than that. So it's in the toilet, and now we have this decision that's come out, which basically means that as we are getting closer to the deadline, when a lot of these student loan payments are going to be required to resume, it's going to get even worse. And keep in mind, without young voters, Biden does not become the president, right? We still have Donald Trump as the president without, young voters being energized in this way. And also keep in mind, I mean, part of the reason why I think that Joe Biden went with the HEROES Act instead of the Higher Education Act is because he didn't really believe in doing this kind of student loan forgiveness. I mean, this was something that like Bernie pressured him a lot to do, young voters pressured him a lot to do, and then he sort of like half-assed it. He means tested it. It was only $10,000 to $20,000, and of course, using that other justification, it's like he probably just didn't want to set the precedent that the Secretary of Education, under this long-standing, 1965 Act, would have that authority. So I think that plays a lot into this, because the 1965 Higher Education Act would have been a lot easier to actually argue in front of the Supreme Court, but also at the same time, it's not as if this was some sort of like principled decision that came down from SCOTUS in this instance, and I'll get to that more here in a second, because essentially both of these cases that were brought before the court completely lacked standing, meaning like the Supreme Court should not have even heard these cases in the first place, let alone use these as justifications to strike down student debt. The people, the organizations, the institutions that were bringing these cases did not have standing. There was no harm that was actually determined to be able to get this case in front of the Supreme Court in the first place, but of course, because it's partisan, because they are political actors, they decided to do it and strike it down. But they continue here. They say Republicans, of course, welcomed the ruling, with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky saying Biden's student loan socialism plan would be a raw deal for hard-working taxpayers. I mean, again, it's such bullshit. First of all, it's not socialism, okay? We are basically the only country on the face of the planet that has over $1 trillion in student debt in the first place. This isn't something that should exist. This is just talking about having like a functioning society, even under a capitalist system, right? To not have millions, tens of millions of people saddled with student debt for the rest of their goddamn lives. That's not socialism, okay? We're talking about, again, a basic, functioning, and reasonable society. But of course, you also have the obvious hypocrisy angle here, which is that, like, Mitch McConnell is perfectly willing to give tax cuts, to give subsidies, to give breaks to corporate America, the billionaire class. I mean, he voted for Donald Trump's 2017 tax cut that exploded the deficit, that exploded the debt, and that was just a handout to the wealthiest, top 10% within this country. Okay, so that's not a handout, that's not socialism for the rich or whatever, but giving students who are saddled with this debt, over $1 trillion worth of it, that is somehow, socialism or whatever the fuck. I mean, it's just such bullshit. But they continue. They say separately, the student loan repayment process is set to begin again in the end of August after having been put on pause during the COVID pandemic, although the first payments will not be due until October. So one thing that I want to mention on this, and I mean, this is super important, obviously, is like people are not going to be able to pay this back. A massive chunk of, according to this report here that was actually back from late September, basically, puts this out in full picture, right? Because it's one thing to say, okay, everybody needs to start paying their bills again, but then what if they can't? I mean, again, as I just pointed out there, we're talking about, we have had like a couple of years now during COVID that this was put on pause. People have adjusted to the reality of maybe there is going to be some relief. Maybe this, pause is going to continue to be extended, but no, now because of the Supreme Court, because of the Republican Party, we are going to have to start aggressively, reinstituting these payments. But they say here, while borrowers who have not completed their degree said resuming payments would cause financial hardship, 58% of respondents with advanced degrees and 56% with bachelor's degrees said that they were in the same boat. So in other words, like a majority of people who have these student debt loans, right, are not going to be able to reasonably pay these back. Okay, so this is just going to be a financial debt bomb that is put on the shoulder of those 43 million people. But they continue here with more information on like the actual cases themselves, and this is where we get to how really bullshit this entire situation was. They say the court considered two cases, one brought by 6 states, including Missouri, and the other brought by 2 people who hold student loan debt, Myra Brown and Alexander Taylor. The court ruled that the program was unlawful in the case brought by states, but found in the second case that the challengers did not have legal standing. Okay, so let's just pause on this for a second, right? So they found that the program was unlawful in the case brought by the states, but found in the second case. So they threw out this second case involving these 2 people, but the one that was brought by the states, they are saying that this one did have legal standing. Let me show you guys something. Here is pointed out by the American Prospect. The student loan case's unwilling participant. Well, what are they talking about here? They say internal documents from the company at the heart of the Supreme Court case on student debt cancellation reinforce that it did not file, did not solicit, and indeed had nothing to do with the case at all. The documents are internal emails from the Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority, known as MOHELA, a student loan servicer that conducts day-to-day operations on federal student loans. Its role in the student debt case is central. The state of Missouri, one of the plaintiffs that they were just referencing there in their decisions, is claiming that MOHELA will lose its revenue as a result of debt cancellation and therefore would be unable to repay money into a Missouri state fund that funds in-state schools. So this is how you determine standing in front of the Supreme Court, right? You have to determine that some entity is being harmed by the policy, financially harmed by the policy. So that was the claim that they made. Now here's the reality. They say that claim has been called into question. In Supreme Court oral arguments, it was revealed that MOHELA hasn't made a contribution to that fund in 15 years. And also, MOHELA has said in its own financial documents that it doesn't plan to make any payments in the future. Furthermore, an analysis from the Roosevelt Institute and the Debt Collective shows that MOHELA stands to gain revenue if the debt cancellation goes forward because it received additional servicing rights and its liability on certain accounts would be extinguished. Okay, so in other words, they did not have any fucking standing. Okay, this entire case was astroturfed. This entire case was bullshit from the ground up. And the Supreme Court not only said, yes, it does have standing, entirely made up, but then also we're going to use this as a justification to strike down the policy. I mean, just to put it in perspective for you guys, how completely absurd and corrupt this entire process has been, right? But they continue here. Now we get a take from some of the liberals on the court. They say the three liberal justices on the conservative majority bench dissented, with Justice Elena Kagan saying that by ruling against the plan, the court had exceeded its proper limited role in our nation's governance. True, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're basically legislating here. Okay, this is not like, you know, the will of the American people. This is not legislation that's being brought by Congress. This is just some, like, you know, high priests sitting up on the Supreme Court corruptly making these decisions, right, against the will of the American people. And she says that the states bringing the challenge did not have legal standing, as we just pointed out there, to even bring the case at all. And in analyzing the HEROES Act, the conservative justices ignored the clear language of the law. And she says the result here is that the court substitutes itself for Congress and the executive branch in making national policy about student debt forgiveness. And she's 100% correct there. Now, we had another point in terms of the corrupt aspect of all of this, as pointed out here by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She says Justice Samuel Alito, who we just talked about recently, you know, going on those fishing trips with that, you know, billionaire Republican, you know, donor guy who was basically taking him on these lavish vacations and then also had cases before the Supreme Court that Samuel Alito did not recuse himself from and then didn't even end up reporting on the official files that he was getting these lavish vacations from this guy, right? So we already know how corrupt many members of the Supreme Court are. But on top of that, Alito accepted tens of thousands of dollars in a lavish vacation gifts from a billionaire who lobbied to cancel student debt forgiveness. After the gifts, Alito voted to overturn. This SCOTUS's corruption undercuts its own legitimacy by putting its rulings up for sale. This is how the Supreme Court works. And they had the audacity to turn around and pretend as if, like, no, we are just principled arbiters of what the Constitution, you know, what the constitutionality of any given policy should be. I mean, it's entirely made up. These people are just corrupt. The way that they've even gotten to their seats in the first place, especially under the Trump administration, you had three people who were backed by, like, the Federalist Society and all of these Republican mega donors and lobbying groups. Okay, so there's corruption in the sense of how they get to these positions in the first place. And then even as they are members of the court with cases in front of them from some of their billionaire buddies, they don't recuse themselves. They don't report or disclose any of the information. I mean, it's just a giant corrupt circle jerk. And obviously, I mean, they're just discrediting themselves, as she points out there. But this is how they're basically turning around and trying to defend themselves. Here from Fox News. Chief Justice John Roberts calls out Democrats demonizing the Supreme Court opinions they don't like. Here's the quote: "It has become a disturbing feature of some recent opinions to criticize the decisions with which they disagree." Okay, so this is how they view themselves, right? They literally think that they are gods, right? They think that they should be able to make all of these incredibly unpopular decisions, whether it's on, the LGBTQ discrimination, whether it's on abortion rights, whether it's on student debt forgiveness. They think they should just in a extremely hyper-partisan way, be able to destroy the lives of tens of millions of people, and then that everybody should just be polite to them and grateful to them for being in these positions and having these super high-minded opinions or whatever the fuck. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, right? I mean, honestly, I think we should engage in more court stripping and just, honestly, putting forward explicit legislation that says the Supreme Court is not allowed to make these sort of judicial rulings or use judicial review in circumstances like this, because they are way too powerful. Okay, not only are they corrupt, but then they are using those, corrupting influences to just, again, wreak havoc on the lives of tens of millions of Americans, right? So, I mean, they shouldn't have this power. We need to start actually aggressively confronting the power that these Supreme Court justice members have. Now, on top of that, we also have Joe Biden, who's basically just kind of going with the same line as John Roberts. I mean, there's been some conflicting statements that he's put out. In some circumstance, he'll give the most mild critique of the Supreme Court that you could possibly imagine and finger wag and be well, I don't agree with that decision. But then on the other hand, he'll still defend the institution in and of itself. And I just saw a recent interview that he did with Nicole Wallace over on MSNBC, where Biden was basically saying, she asked a question about, well, do you agree with people who want to actually make, real systemic reforms to the Supreme Court? And he said no, because that would make it even more politicized and that they might lose even more legitimacy permanently in the future. Look at what they're saying. They are doing this to themselves. They have already lost all legitimacy, not that they really deserved any in the first place. And now I want to get to this aspect of it, because this is just even more absurd hypocrisy coming from a lot of Republicans, right? We just talked about the Mitch McConnell aspect of this, and now we get to this aspect of it with conservative pundits and all of these media organizations, and then also politicians as well. As pointed out here by Jordan Ewell, he put together a good thread here. So the Daily Caller tweets out, the Supreme Court has blocked Biden's student loan giveaway, and they point out here that the Daily Caller got essentially hundreds and hundreds, it looks like over $1 million in some of these PPP loans that were forgiven by the government. So you get forgiveness, but student debtors don't get forgiveness, right? People who committed the crime of, going to try to get a higher education, they don't get that forgiveness, but you do get that forgiveness, right? Again, you can scroll through this. I'll put it in the description if you want. All of these Republicans who are coming out with these tweets, praising this Supreme Court decision and saying how unfair it would be if these people got this student debt forgiveness, they're all now coming out and being exposed for getting hundreds of thousands of dollars forgiven by the federal government. And then another thing that I wanted to just mention here briefly, because it just gives you a perspective in terms of the bipartisan nature of not wanting to help average, working class Americans. Representative Nancy Pelosi, as pointed out here by Nina Turner, was cited in the student debt ruling unacceptable. Okay, they got a direct quote here from Pelosi, and I remember covering this on my channel. She says, people think that the president has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress, and that is essentially almost word for word what the Supreme Court said in their ruling. So, I mean, look, again, this isn't surprising. It's not a surprising decision. We'll have to see what the Biden administration decides to do from here. Again, he said that he's somewhat open to trying again to use the 1965 Higher Education Act. Is that going to be enough? Honestly, I don't know, given the extreme partisan nature of the current makeup of the Supreme Court. But I mean, this is something you should have done from the beginning. You should have canceled all of it. You shouldn't have done this measly, half-assed, $10,000 to $20,000 and it's means tested and all of that stuff. You should have just done the entirety of it. You should have used the 1965 Higher Education Act, which was a much stronger argument from the beginning. And then also, how about Democrats actually confront the power of this massively corrupt and partisan Supreme Court? I mean, this is what people elected you to do. People did not elect you to be like a defender of these sacred institutions or whatever the fuck. No, actually go and fight for people. Actually try to go implement policies that broadly help working class Americans in this country, or you are going to get absolutely obliterated in the next election cycle.
Everyone is saying GoodPoliticGuy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying